Wherefore, seeing that we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds. You have not resisted unto blood, striving against sin. I want to stop there, though I'm not, I'll probably go beyond that verse tonight, but that's a good place to stop. I call your attention in chapter 11 back to verse 13. It says, these all died in faith. These all died in faith. And then in verse 39 of the same chapter, and these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. All of these, in verse 11, received a good report. A good report. That is, the report card was handed out, and they got a good report. And as I read the chapter and read about their lives in the Old Testament, I know what they had to do, and I know why they got a good report. And when I read what was required to get a good report, sometimes I get a little concerned about test day. These all died in faith, verse 13, not having received the promises. They never got what was promised them. They lived all of their life expecting and never got. And in verse 11, or verse 39, they never received the promise. In verse 39, they never received it. But they had faith, and they died in faith, and they got a good report. Now, when we come to chapter 12, Paul then shifts to you and me, or to the reader, and now he takes what he has said in the first 11 chapters, and he says, now here's what you ought to do. Having read about those who died in faith and received a good report, and having read about those who never received the promises, but they had a good report, here's what you ought to do if you want a good report. And the first thing that he tells us that, and by the way, these people were undergoing great persecution. The book of Hebrews was written in the early part of the book of Acts. In the early part of it, probably it may have been written during those 3 years that Paul was in Arabia, if Paul is the writer. And realizing that Christians during that period of time were under great persecution. Not only were they being persecuted by the Jews at that time, but the Apostle Paul had just ended his own great persecution of the church. In fact, it says he made havoc of the church, remember? Hailing men and women into prison. I don't think that all of that persecution stopped just because Paul got saved. In fact, he then became the object of that persecution. And if you remember, they took Stephen and they stoned him. They took James and cut off his head. They took Peter and threw him in jail. They took Paul and took him and repeatedly tried to kill him. So you know that the persecution didn't stop with the conversion of the Apostle Paul. Just like you at work, and before you get saved, you are among the ungodly, and you think once you get saved, everything at work has changed. Nothing has changed at work, has it? So when Paul got saved, the only thing that changed was Paul ceased being a persecutor of the church, but the church was under great persecution. So Paul is writing to, or the writer here is writing to those Hebrew Christians, the Hebrews, who were undergoing great persecution. Now, this book will really have meaning in the tribulation period, because it will once again be the Hebrews, or the believers during that period of time, primarily Jews, who will undergo the great persecution. And so he tells these believers that all of those before, the fathers, they died in faith, verse 13, not having received the promises. Then he says in verse 39 of chapter 11, these received a good report, never receiving the promise. Wherefore, chapter 12, verse 1, and wherefore and therefore apply to that which has gone before. And the first thing he tells them is that they need to look to the Lord, they need to look to these fathers, these patriarchs, as examples and learn from them what they should do under persecution. He says in verse 1, "Wherefore, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." Now, I think that these witnesses are those referred to in chapter 11. Paul says in the book of Galatians that you have come to the church of the firstborn, the New Jerusalem, and to the assembly, an innumerable company of angels, etc. And that is a group that, and this group in chapter 11, who have already gone ahead. And they, if they endure, will be joining them. So they are to look to these in the Old Testament and those found in chapter 11 as an example. "Wherefore, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that doth so easily beset us." Now, it's not hard to look back at the Old Testament and find professing runners who lost in the race for the kingdom because of a particular weight or a particular sin. You wouldn't have to search hard to find them, would you? Remember Elisha's assistant pastor? His name was Gehazi. And when Naaman the leper came to Elisha to be healed, he offered to pay him for services rendered. And Elisha said, "This is not the time to take money or lands. This is not the time." So he refused it. And Naaman the leper said, "Then could I borrow some soil from Israel, a bag of dirt, so that when I take my master into the house of the false gods, that I can take some of this dirt and kneel on it?" Now that's something, isn't it? That's what he wanted. He wanted a bag of dirt from Israel so that when he knelt in a pagan house, that he could kneel on that soil from Israel and pray. And Elisha gave it to him. And Naaman the leper went on his way. But his assistant pastor thought that was a foolish thing to do. I mean, here it is, a time of famine, time of Israel's persecution, and here is a wealthy man who offered some money. So he got on his horse, unbeknownst to his pastor, and took off after the healed leper and overtook him. And the Naaman was so thrilled at what had happened, he looked back and he saw the man and he said, "Is everything okay?" He said, "Everything's okay. However, after you left, a band of visitors came and we need something for them. We need to buy some supplies for them." And so basically he's saying that my master sent me, that he's changed his mind. We need some money. You know the story if you read your Bible. Well, the Naaman the leper is so overjoyed and so willing because of what God has done in his life, he just takes the purse out and dumps all the gold he can into this young man's pocket. The young man goes back home and hides it, and then he goes on about his business, his duties. He forgets one thing. God told Elisha what had happened. And he confronted him, and the leprosy that had been on Naaman the leper became the leprosy of Gehazi, the young prophet, and he died a leper. He started out running well, and he had a good example. But there was a weight and a sin that beset him. And he got out of the race, and he was a has-been. Are you listening to me? It's all over. I'm thinking of a fellow by the name of Abraham, the friend of God, who left his country and left idolatry and went into the land of God, the promised land, and he took a nephew with him. And that nephew was blessed as long as he stayed close to Uncle Abraham. And God began to bless them until the land couldn't support them. And there was a conflict between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen. And Lot, being the man that he was, went to his nephew and said, "Let there be no strife between us." He said, "The land is before us." Abraham said, "You go to the right, I'll go to the left. You go to the left, I'll go to the right. Makes no difference to me." And Lot had already been looking over the land of Sodom. And the Bible says that he looked toward the land of Sodom, and it was like the Garden of Eden. And he chose it. And he moved in because it looked like that there was good economy there and some dancing girls, and everything looked good. And he moved in. And that was his undoing, wasn't it? Before it's over with, he's been promoted to one of the fathers of the city. He's lost his daughters. They've married the ungodly. His own family now laughs at him. His wife is in love with the city. And when Lot stands up to say, let's flee this place, the Bible said he seemed as one that mocked. And he got out by the skin of his teeth. And you know the rest of the story. His own daughters got him drunk, committed incest with him, and he became the father of his children by his own daughters. And of course, you have the enemies of Israel from that relationship, and Lot is out of the running. Out of the running. He started well, just like Gehazi. And so what the writer is saying to you and me in chapter 12 and verse 1 is that we need to keep looking to these Old Testament saints, and we need to learn about why some failed and why some succeeded. And those who failed had a weight or a besetting sin. And God says that you and I had better lay it aside. Because if you don't, the thing about sin is it grows. Sin is not a rock that stays the same. Sin is a fungus. It's a disease that grows. Now I'm telling you, it grows. It's not just some inanimate object that you can just put away and leave. It will follow you. You didn't start out a pack a day. That's not the way you started. You started with one out in the woodshed. That's how you started. But now it's a pack a day or 2 packs a day. I'm talking about cigarettes. You didn't become a drunk instantly. You just started the little party game, you know, and you were with the people, and the next thing you know, you can't put it away. You see? See, you didn't start out into child molesting and pornography. You just kind of hung around the shop, the newsstand, and kind of flipped through the pages, right? I mean, that's the way it starts. You're not born a drunk or born an addict, and I guess some kids are when they're on crack, but I'm not talking to that crowd. I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you. And God says you'd better lay it aside. You see, that which you and I do today with moderation, tomorrow we will do in excess. I promise you. You just start talking dirty a little today, you'll be talking filthy tomorrow. You start just toying around and flirting with sex, you'll be in the sack the next thing you know. And your life will be ruined. Nobody falls into bed, they just kind of waltz that way. Nobody just starts a pack a day. It's one now and one then. And I tell you what, this matter, some of this music, it's not music. And you kids know it, bless your heart, you know it's not music, it's jungle rot. You know, when I was a kid back in the Stone Age, I used to love to watch Tarzan the Ape Man. That's when you could watch him. And Jane had a few clothes on. But here's my point. My point is that back in the early 50s and late 40s, do you know that in the jungles of Africa, those voodoo people and those witchcraft people and those people that were eating human sacrifices, do you know they were singing the very same music that you're listening to on television today? I know what I'm talking about. It's the same stuff. It's the same. And you know what it is? It's sex music. And you know it. That's why you like it. That's why you like it. That's what it is. And maybe I should preach to some of you adults too. You're not any better. You're not any better. You sit and watch it and listen to it. Now, I tell you what. You may do some things in moderation. But I guarantee you, just like Samson, he kept toying with sin, and he kept believing that he could win every battle. But he didn't. Eventually, Samson is blind with his eyes gouged out. just like you will be. Some of you already are spiritually blind. You're as blind as a bat coming in backwards when it comes to spiritual matters. Oh, you've got a religious truth here and there, and you know a few things, and you can talk the language, but you can't live the life. What you talk doesn't work, does it? That's why it isn't real. What you talk is not working. And I'll bet you if I hid where you work and stood in the balcony and watched you for an hour, it wouldn't take long to find out. It'd be interesting at work if the video camera was on your life and brought it home and played it for your husband or wife. You'd have some explaining to do, wouldn't you? Well, you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to. You're a Christian, aren't you? Aren't you born again? Well, then you ought to live it. And so what he says here is that you need to be looking to those who went before, whose lives were righteous, if you're going to run this race with success. And I'm telling you what, I see Christians dropping out like flies. They don't make it. I guess they're Christians. They say they are. You say, well, they came to church. Yeah, they did. They carried a big Bible. They even taught Sunday school and drove a bus and sang in the choir. I guess they're Christians. They say they are. I guess they are. But I don't know. Do you know? Well, of course you don't know. They say they are. They say they are, but in works they deny him. Isn't that what it says? Sure. They say they are. Well, if a man says he's a Christian, he must be. No, he must not be. He may not be. I find if any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. Don't you? Old things pass away. Now, you may sin in your life, but if your life is a life of sin, you need to check your birth. See? I said, you may sin, but if your life is a life of sin, you better check your birth. You got the wrong father. So if you're going to live by faith and run this race, you need first of all to look to these saints as examples. And you need to learn what a real righteous child of God is. These all died in faith. You know, I think about, I don't care what you say. I know Simon Peter cursed and swore and denied the Lord. But he didn't live his life that way. He was willing to die for Jesus Christ before he ever used profanity. And he meant it. And then after the Lord looked at him, he went out and he wept bitterly and he repented, which is more than most Christians ever do. I'm yet to see a Christian who really weeps over sin. We weep over Lassie more than we weep over sin. I don't see Christians weeping over sin. Never. Oh, maybe once or twice. And and then there's David. Sure, David committed adultery. And by the way, he ruined his life and ruined his kingdom and ruined his family. But he repented of it. See? Whereas Judas was a phony all the time, but he was kissing the Lord. Right? See, God's not interested in your kisses. He's interested in your holiness. That's what he's interested in. Kisses don't mean anything necessarily. We need to learn how to do certain things as we look back at these examples. We discover that it was their life which pleased God. And we can relate with their joy and their sorrow and their expenses, their experiences. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, it says, now all these things happen unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition. They certainly were. Chapter 11 wasn't written for those people. Why, they were all dead. So it's written for you, and it's written for me. So we need to be looking and learning. You know, I hear, when you know a few pastors and somebody falls by the wayside, I hear about it, and pretty soon I hear so much of it, I wonder if there's any Bible-believing pastors left, but I know better. When I shake myself and try to get that gossip out of my ear, then I start thinking of all of those people I know that have stood for God. Amen. And I guarantee you there's far more that are standing for God than those that are falling. Right. But if all you hear about are those that are falling, pretty soon you think that's all there is. Yeah. No, everybody in America is not bad. There's some good folks. Everybody's not a crook. Maybe everybody you know is a crook, but not everybody's a crook. See? Not everybody. There's some good people. There are. There's some folks that love the Lord. But if you focus in that this is the way everybody is, and you hear this on the news constantly, because the news media is not supposed to give you good news, because good news is not news. Right. You listen to the weather. It's not going to be good. I mean, we're expecting some sun tomorrow, but it will be partially clouded with drizzle. You know. I don't care what you say, you've got to mess it up, because good news is not, it won't sell. You put a King James Bible at the news store at Olson, and you put one of these scandal sheets, you know, my mother married an alien with 7 heads, and you see which one sells. You see which one sells. People love gossip. They love it. Because it's a feeling of pride to be the first to run and tell it. Right? You got to have some new thing to run and tell somebody. That way they'll think you know something. But I'd be careful what I tell. They may know where you're getting it. We need to be looking to Jesus. All these things happen to them for examples, or in samples or examples, and they are written for our admonition upon whom the end of the world will come, or the end of the age has come. So as we run this race in verse 12, wherefore seeing or verse 1 of chapter 12, wherefore seeing we're compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight. Every weight. Is there anything in your life that's hindering your progress for God? Not really? Well, you amaze me. I would think you surely would find something. Have we come to the Laodicean church where we have need of nothing? Or can you think of something? Huh? I'll bet you can. I'll bet you if you can't, you ought to go to the prayer room and ask God to show it to you. I bet He knows something. Don't you? Well, if you can, you ought to take care of it. Because if you don't, it's sin. And if you can't think of anything and you want to be right, you ought to ask Him to reveal it. David said, search me, O God, and see if there be any wicked way in me. He talked about secret faults, that is, things he didn't know that he had. See? Now, I think it's possible. I think it's possible for an individual to be in a state to where he or she may not be conscious of anything wrong in their life. But I guarantee you some more Bible study and some more prayer will scrape the cover off of something. Life is like an onion. God peels one layer at a time. He really does. One layer at a time. And that's good, because the more He peels it, the more He can get closer to your heart. Saying. But some of us, we don't want God close to our heart, so we stop letting Him do the peeling. You know what we do to the onion? We petrify it. That way God can't peel it. Now He has to get a hammer and break it. And He will. Don't kid yourself. The hammer just hasn't fallen yet. But it's coming. If there's a God, it's coming. And if there is no God, you're free. You're scot-free. So go on, eat, drink, and be merry. We need to look to others. I am thankful that there's people like Dr. Dennis Brown in Yakima, Washington. I've known Dr. Brown for 24 years. Dr. Brown, I mean, he was a Bible Baptist, and I was a whatever I am and was. Do you know he took me right in, had me to preach for him? He's preached in my church several times, this church several times. I preached at missions conferences. I preached at a missions conference in Yakima with Dr. Brown and Dr. Clifford Clark, who I think was probably one of the presidents or vice presidents of the Baptist Bible Fellowship, whatever that means. Doesn't mean much to me, but I'm just talking about matter of fact, he said to me one time, he said, Brother Blue, if I ever die, and that's what I begin to wonder. He's about 90. He was pastoring 2 churches at 80, Greeley, Colorado, and the one in Yakima. Do you know Dr. Brown? Yeah, Dr. Brown. I said to somebody the other day, who was I talking to? Oh, Scott Gregson. I asked him about Dr. Brown. He says, well, he's still alive. He's not doing very well. But last time I saw him, he was kind of feeble, kind of shuffling around. But he was, he's pushing 90 at that time. You know, I'd like to live to be feeble, wouldn't you, at about 90 or 100? Shut up. I know what you're thinking. You're judging me again. No. I was sitting right in my office tonight counseling, not counseling, but talking about the wedding, you know, for a couple. And I can't think of their name right now. Andrew and Michelle. And all the way through, I was looking right at him, couldn't think of his name. He said, "My name's Andrew." I said, "Well, thanks. I'm Pastor Blue." But it happens. But I'm so thankful that, you know, when I get to hearing about these people that are falling by the wayside, and there's too many. But I'm thankful for men like Dr. Brown, Dr. Herb Noe. I mean, that guy is probably 70, 75, maybe more than that. One leg, cancer. I preached for him last year in Detroit. Still preaching. Still pastoring. Dr. Tom Malone, I guess 80 maybe. Still trying to pastor the Emmanuel Baptist Church in Pontiac, Michigan. See, Dr. Paul Vanneman was probably 60 or 70, something like that, 65, 70. Drowned here just the other day. Good family man, had 8 or 9 kids. Good family. I mean, you could just go on and on. There was J. Frank Norris, Dr. Lee Robertson, Dr. R.G. Lee. I mean, there's some men that lived to be old men and were faithful to their family and to their ministry and to their God. And you can be, and you should be, and you ought to be. And you're not going to excuse yourself by looking at other people and say, "Well, this is what so-and-so's doing. Just nobody living for God." Let me tell you, Elijah tried that, and it got him in trouble. Elijah began to look around and feel sorry for himself, and he really probably wanted to sin, and he got to looking around, and he said, "Well, just nobody living for God but me. You might as well take me on home." God said, "You got your wish. You're out of here." And he got another guy to take his place. And I guarantee you, God's got somebody that can just fill this place where you're sitting right now. There's somebody else take your place. And they might do it better. They just might. Did you know Elisha did twice as many miracles as Elijah? He did twice as many. So we need to look to these people and learn. I hope you will. I hope you can. You say, "Well, what would make you say I can't?" Well, I just read in Matthew 13 tonight about some people who can't. Let's go to Matthew 13 and see what might be our problem. No, it wouldn't surprise me at all now. And this crowd's a little small and might not have that problem. But you take a Sunday morning or a Sunday night crowd, there's got to be some people that fit this description. If you'll notice in chapter 13, verse 13, "Therefore spake I unto them in parables, because they seeing see not." Matthew 13:13. It's an interesting 13:13. Notice it says, "Seeing they see not." No deaf or blind here tonight. Everybody here sees, I guess. I really don't know, but I would imagine that everybody here can see, but I wouldn't bet on it. If I was a betting man, I wouldn't bet on it. Notice it says, "Seeing they see not, and hearing they hear not." You thought you worked with the deaf, didn't you? I've been working with the deaf all my ministry. I have. Jesus worked with them too. I worked with the deaf and the blind. "Seeing they see not, hearing they hear not." Look at the rest of it. "Neither do they understand." Now let me tell you, it's one thing for a person to describe a situation like the operation of a computer or the working out of a mathematical problem, and for you to say to the person who's helping you, I understand. That is not the same kind of understanding that's referred to here. Understanding in the Bible means that you not only can hear, but it means that It changes your life. That is understanding. Understanding is to depart from evil. That is understanding. Understanding is not just gathering some biblical facts. Understanding is not just reading a few verses. Understanding is when it changes your life. That is understanding. Saying, I hear you, preacher, but that's not understanding. Understanding is when it gets past your ears and past your eyes into your heart and changes your life. Then understanding has taken place. And only then has understanding taken place. That is why Jesus looked at that crowd and preached to them, and he said, having eyes, they see not. They saw the miracles, but they couldn't see. They heard his great words, and they were going to forcibly make him a king. But they never heard him. They never heard what he said. Do you know I've been preaching to people years, never heard anything I've said? I guarantee you. Folks have been here years, never heard a thing I've said yet. Unless I make a mistake, they hear that. They don't hear. They don't hear. How many times have I said something on Sunday morning about folks need to be in church on Sunday night? They've never showed up, never will. They don't hear it. How many times have I said Sunday morning and Sunday night you need to be in church on Thursday night? Hearing, but hearing not. Seeing, but seeing not. How many times have I said you ought to be reading your Bible on a regular basis? Hearing, but they hear not. Oh, they heard it, but they didn't hear it. Seeing me say it, but they didn't see it. Because if they would have heard it and seen it, they would have understood it and it would have changed their life. But the fact that it did nothing proves that they didn't see it and they didn't hear it. Notice again in our text in Matthew chapter 13, verse 14. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which said, by hearing you shall hear, and shall not understand. And seeing you shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart, there it is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have they closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their what? Heart.